The morning was bright, and the city streets were already buzzing with life. Expensive cars rushed past ordinary ones, and the sound of honking filled the air. In front of a tall glass building stood a luxury car, sleek and shining like a jewel. It belonged to the company's CEO, a man known for his wealth, his power, and his arrogance. He loved to arrive in style, showing off his expensive lifestyle to remind everyone of his success. But on this particular day, something happened that would change the way people looked at him forever. As the CEO stepped out of his office building, ready to leave for an important meeting, he pulled out his keys with a confident smile. He pressed the button, and the car gave a short beep. Employees standing nearby glanced at him, some admiring his wealth, others quietly resenting his attitude. The CEO loved moments like this when eyes followed him and he felt like the center of the universe. He opened the door, sat down, and turned the key in the ignition. But instead of the smooth purr of an expensive engine, all he heard was a dull click. The CEO frowned and tried again. Click. Nothing. His smile disappeared, and his pride started to shake. He pressed harder, twisted the key, and even cursed under his breath. But the car refused to start. For the first time, he felt embarrassed in front of his staff. People around him whispered, trying not to laugh. Its perfect image, which he had worked so hard to build, was cracking right there in front of everyone. Anger quickly replaced his embarrassment. He slammed the steering wheel and stepped out of the car with frustration written all over his face. "Can you believe this?" he shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "This is a luxury car, worth more than any of you could ever dream of owning. And it refuses to start." His voice was loud and sharp, and it echoed across the parking lot. Everyone froze, unsure of whether to respond or stay silent. The CEO began pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. His suit was spotless. His watch gleamed under the sunlight, but his face was twisted in anger. He mocked the situation, turning it into a show. "You see this?" He pointed at the car. "A masterpiece of engineering. Something none of you simple people could understand. If anyone here thinks they can fix it, I'll give them the car itself." He laughed sarcastically, thinking no one would dare step forward. His employees exchanged awkward looks. They knew this was not really an offer, was mockery. The CEO was proud, too proud to admit he needed help. Instead of quietly calling a mechanic, he chose to turn the breakdown into a scene, a stage for his arrogance. For him, everything had to be about power, status, and control. He believed that only people of his level could solve problems, and the rest were beneath him. A few dared to chuckle nervously at his words, more out of fear than amusement. Everyone knew how sharp his tongue could be. He enjoyed belittling others. The employees had seen him insult staff for minor mistakes, reminding them they were replaceable. For him, life was a game of winners and losers, and he always placed himself above everyone else. But now, in this strange moment, the tables seemed to be turning. The mighty CEO, who always carried himself like nothing could go wrong, was standing helpless in front of a car he bragged about endlessly. Sweat formed on his forehead, though the weather was not hot. The thought that his staff might see him as weak burned inside him. So instead of admitting defeat, he put on a mask of arrogance once again. He raised his voice even louder, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "What do you all know about this machine? Nothing? You're all office workers, cleaners, assistants. None of you are capable of touching a car like this. But I'll say it again, fix it, and it's yours." He laughed again, but this time his laugh sounded hollow. It was the laugh of a man trying too hard to hide his own frustration. The scene was both uncomfortable and fascinating for the employees. Some felt pity. Others secretly enjoyed seeing him struggle. After all, it was rare to see a man like him who always walked with his chin high. brought down by something as simple as a car that wouldn't start. In that moment, the CEO's arrogance filled the air thicker than smoke. He thought his wealth made him untouchable, that no ordinary person could ever stand equal to him. He believed mocking others would cover up his embarrassment. But little did he know, someone nearby was about to take his challenge seriously. And when that happened, the CEO's arrogance would no longer protect him, would only make his humiliation sharper. That was the beginning of a lesson he never expected to learn. The crowd of employees stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. The CEO's voice had cut through the air like a whip, and now everyone's attention was fixed on him and his silent car. His expensive suit glimmered in the morning light, but his pride was louder than any shine. He smirked as he looked around, his eyes searching for someone to embarrass further. It was not enough for him that his car refused to start. He had to turn it into a game, a performance where he remained the star. "Look at all of you," he said, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "Bright minds, college degrees, and yet, not a single one of you knows how to deal with a simple problem. You sit behind desks, type on computers, shuffle papers, and think you're doing important work. But here," he slapped the hood of the car, "is something real, something only true intelligence can handle." A nervous laugh escaped from one of the employees in the back, and the CEO's sharp eyes immediately locked onto him. "You find this funny, do you?" he asked coldly. The employee quickly shook his head and looked down at his shoes, wishing he could disappear. The rest of the staff stiffened, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Everyone knew how the CEO thrived on humiliating others. He believed that mocking people proved his superiority. And he enjoyed doing it in front of an audience. And then his gaze shifted. His eyes landed on someone standing quietly to the side, a man with a broom in his hand, dressed in a plain uniform that carried the faint smell of cleaning supplies. It was the janitor who had been sweeping the floor nearby when all the commotion began. The CEO's smirk widened. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look who's standing here, our janitor. Tell me, do you even know what this car is? Do you think you could tell the difference between this engine and a washing machine? Maybe you can polish it with that broom of yours, but fix it? Impossible." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter broke out among a few employees. It wasn't real laughter, it was the nervous kind, forced out of fear. Nobody wanted to be seen disagreeing with the CEO. He was the kind of man who remembered insults for years and never forgave them. To survive in his world, sometimes people laughed when he mocked others, even if it felt wrong. The janitor, however, did not laugh. He simply stood there, holding his broom, his expression calm. He had been insulted before, in life, many times. In fact, this was not the first man to look down on him because of his job or his clothes. Still, the sting of the words cut deep. Though he didn't let it show. The CEO noticed the janitor's silence and decided to push further. He raised his voice and said, "Tell you what, since you're just standing there like a statue, why don't you try fixing it? I'll even keep my word. If you can fix it, the car is yours." Imagine that, a janitor driving a car worth more than your entire salary for the next 20 years. He laughed loudly, slapping his thigh as if he had just made the funniest joke in the world. The employees shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak up. Some looked at the janitor with sympathy. Others avoided his eyes out of shame. They knew this wasn't fair, but fairness had no place under the CEO's rule. His words were law, and if he decided to humiliate someone, no one could stop him. One of the younger employees whispered softly to a colleague, "Why does he always pick on people like that?" The colleague shook his head and whispered back, "Because he can. That's all he cares about, power." Their words were nearly inaudible, drowned by the CEO's booming voice as he continued to ridicule. The janitor finally moved. He leaned his broom against the wall, his face still composed. The CEO raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh, are you actually going to try? This will be fun," he said with mock excitement. "Everyone, gather around. Let's watch our janitor. Try to play mechanic. Maybe he'll use his mop water to cool the engine. Eh?" His laughter was sharp, and again a few forced chuckles followed. But deep inside, the CEO was not only mocking the janitor, he was protecting himself. His car had betrayed him, his pride was wounded, and the only way he knew how to recover was by tearing someone else down. He could make the janitor look foolish. Then the spotlight would move away from his own failure. The employees, though quiet, were not blind. They could see the cruelty in his words. They could feel the tension in the air. Some of them secretly hoped that, for once, the CEO's arrogance would backfire. They didn't know how, but something in their hearts wished the janitor would surprise him. The CEO, meanwhile, folded his arms and leaned against the car with confidence. He thought the janitor would hesitate, mumble excuses, and walk away embarrassed. That was the outcome he wanted. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the janitor's calmness was not born of fear. It was born of experience. And while the CEO mocked and ridiculed, believing himself untouchable, the stage was quietly being set for a moment that would leave him frozen in disbelief. The very man he thought least capable was about to turn his arrogance into the greatest humiliation of his life. The parking lot was heavy with silence after the CEO's laughter died away. Everyone's eyes were now on the janitor, the man who had been sweeping the floor only moments ago. Sprum leaned quietly against the wall, almost like a soldier resting after duty. The janitor stood there, tall but calm, his hands steady, his face unreadable. Unlike the CEO, he didn't need to shout or wave his arms. His silence was powerful in its own way. Some employees noticed the stillness in his eyes, like a quiet lake that hid something deeper below the surface. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shame. It was patience. A patience that seemed to irritate the CEO even more. "Why are you just standing there?" The CEO sneered, his voice sharp with mockery. "Scared? Lost your tongue. I knew it. All you're good for is pushing a mop. Don't think for a second you belong anywhere near a car like this." But the janitor did not react. He didn't flinch, he didn't lower his head, and he didn't argue. He just looked at the CEO with calm eyes, as though the man's insults were bouncing off him like raindrops on stone. That calmness unsettled the crowd. They expected anger or embarrassment, but instead, they saw quiet strength. One of the employees whispered softly, "He's not afraid." Another leaned closer and asked, "But why isn't he saying anything? Doesn't he care?" The truth was, the janitor had learned long ago that words often did nothing against arrogance. Arguing with men like the CEO only fed their pride. Silence, on the other hand, carried its own kind of power. And he had carried this silence with him for years through hardships, through insults, through the many times life had tried to break him. The CEO, however, mistook that silence for weakness. He puffed out his chest and smirked. Look at him. Everyone frozen in place. He can't even take one step forward. This is what happens when you try to rise above your station. Stay in your lane, janitor. Know your place. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of them wanted to speak up for the janitor, but fear held their voices back. Nobody dared to stand against the CEO. The janitor, however, wasn't angry at them. He understood. People often stayed quiet, not because they agreed with cruelty, but because they feared the consequences of defiance. Then, in a voice low but steady, the janitor finally spoke. "Sir," he said, "may I try?" The simple words hung in the air like a challenge, though they were spoken without arrogance. They were soft, polite, but filled with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the CEO blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly. He hadn't expected the janitor to speak. He hadn't expected him to face the humiliation so directly. "What did you say?" the CEO asked, narrowing his eyes. "I said, may I try?" The janitor repeated, his voice calm, almost soothing. There was no anger, no desperation, only an unshakable composure that made the employees lean in closer, curious. The CEO laughed, though his laugh sounded thinner than before. "Oh, this is rich. The janitor thinks he can fix my luxury car. Did you all hear that? This is comedy gold." He turned to the crowd, hoping they would laugh with him. Some forced a chuckle, but it was weaker this time. The janitor's calmness had changed something in the air. The employees weren't just laughing at him anymore. They were watching him, waiting. The janitor stepped forward slowly, each movement measured and deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. He carried himself with dignity, as if this wasn't a challenge meant to humiliate him, but simply another task. No different from sweeping a floor or changing a light bulb. His calm presence made the noisy CEO seem smaller, almost childish in comparison. The CEO crossed his arms, trying to regain control. "Fine," he said, mockingly. "Go ahead, show us what you've got, but don't cry when you embarrass yourself." The janitor simply nodded, not rising to the insult. He approached the car and placed his hand gently on the hood, as though greeting an old friend. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and in that moment, the employees saw something remarkably at peace. Even under the weight of ridicule, some of them exchanged glances. They had never seen anyone stand up to the CEO in this way, not by shouting, not by arguing, but by remaining calm, unshaken. It was as if the janitor was teaching them a lesson without even trying, that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. The CEO tapped his foot impatiently. "Any day now," he said, rolling his eyes. But deep inside, a sliver of doubt crept in. Something about the janitor's calmness unsettled him. He wanted to believe this was just another joke, another way to prove his superiority. Yet a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if he can actually do it?" The janitor finally opened his eyes and gave a small nod. He was ready. And though the crowd didn't know it yet, this was the beginning of a moment that would turn the CEO's arrogance into silence and leave everyone witnessing a lesson they would never forget. The moment the janitor's calm voice broke through the tension, the entire crowd leaned in closer. His words had been simple, "May I try?" But those words had carried a weight that no one expected. It wasn't the voice of a man desperate to prove himself. It wasn't the voice of someone scared of humiliation. It was the voice of someone who knew his own worth even if no one else did. The CEO tilted his head back and laughed. The sound echoed off the glass walls of the building, sharp and hollow. "You," he said, pointing at the janitor like a teacher mocking a foolish student. "You think you can fix this? This car costs more than your entire life. What do you know about engines? You can't even afford a bicycle without counting coins." The employees stood silently, their faces tight. They were used to the CEO's insults, but this felt different. The janitor's quiet strength was unsettling their boss, and everyone could feel it. Still, none dared to speak. It was safer to watch and wait. The janitor didn't argue. He didn't defend himself or try to explain. Instead, he took one small step toward the car. Then another. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost like a man walking into a storm he had faced before. His calm movements only made the CEO more restless. "Fine," the CEO shouted, throwing his arms out dramatically. "Go ahead, janitor. Show us your magic. Fix my car, and it's yours. You heard me, everyone, didn't you?" If he fixes it, I'll hand him the keys." He laughed again, though this time his laugh felt forced. His arrogance had trapped him. He had made a promise in front of witnesses, and he couldn't take it back. The janitor gave a small nod. His expression was unreadable, neither proud nor afraid. He simply reached for the broom he had left by the wall and leaned it carefully against the side, as if to say, "Now, let's get serious." A few employees whispered among themselves, "Do you think he really knows how to fix it?" One asked. "I don't know, but look at him," another replied. "He doesn't look nervous at all." "Yeah," a third whispered. "He looks like he's done this before." The CEO caught their whispers and snapped, "Don't waste your breath. This is going to be the funniest thing you'll see all week." He then leaned against the car with a smug smile, folding his arms as though he had already won. The janitor approached the car and stood before the hood, his hand resting lightly on the metal. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes again, listening not to the noise around him, but to something within. It was a quiet ritual he had kept for years, a way to steady himself before tackling any challenge. The crowd was confused. To them, it looked like hesitation. To the CEO, it looked like defeat. "What's the matter?" the CEO mocked. "Don't tell me you're praying for a miracle. You'll need one." Laughter followed from a few voices, but again, it was nervous laughter. Something about the janitor's stillness made it difficult for anyone to truly enjoy the CEO's ridicule. Finally, the janitor spoke again, his voice calm as ever. "You said the car would be mine if I fix it. Do you stand by your word?" The CEO blinked. For a second, he was caught off guard. No one ever questioned his words. People usually just obeyed or stayed quiet. But this janitor had looked him in the eye and asked for confirmation. It wasn't defiance, was a demand for accountability. "Yes," the CEO said firmly, regaining his composure. "I stand by it. Fix it, and you can drive it out of here today. But that will never happen." He smirked and added, "And when you fail, don't come crying. Go back to your mop." The janitor nodded once. That was all he needed. Without another word, he gently lifted the hood of the car. The engine lay exposed, complex and intimidating, a maze of wires, tubes, and polished metal. The crowd leaned closer, holding their breath. The CEO scoffed. "Look at him. He doesn't even know where to start." But inside, the CEO felt a flicker of unease. Something about the janitor's calm movements bothered him. It didn't look like confusion. It looked like familiarity. The janitor's hands moved with care, not fumbling like someone pretending, but steady like someone who had touched countless engines before. The employees noticed it too. Their whispers grew louder, though still cautious. "Wait, you see the way he's looking at the engine? Yeah, it's like he knows it already. This is strange. Maybe he really can do it." The CEO heard the whispers and grew restless. He raised his voice again, desperate to drown out their growing curiosity. "Don't be fooled. He's stalling. He'll embarrass himself in a minute. You'll see." But the janitor didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than the CEO's insults. Every calm movement of his hands was a quiet declaration. "I know what I'm doing." And in that charged moment, when arrogance and patience stood face to face, the challenge was truly accepted. The janitor was no longer just a cleaner standing in the shadow of a wealthy man. He was about to become the center of the story that would humble the CEO in front of his own empire. The hood of the CEO's luxury car was now lifted, and the janitor stood before it like a man facing an old companion. The crowd pressed closer, their breaths mixing in the cool morning air. Nobody spoke too loudly, as though even whispers might break the tension. For the employees, this was no longer just about a broken car. This was about pride, arrogance, and a man who had been mocked his whole life finally given a chance to show something hidden deep inside. The CEO leaned lazily against the side of the car, pretending to look relaxed, but his fingers drummed impatiently. On the metal, "Come on, janitor," he said mockingly. "Impress us. Or at least entertain us before you make a fool of yourself." His voice carried arrogance, but behind it, there was something else creeping in. A trace of doubt. The janitor did not answer. He didn't even look at the CEO. His focus was fully on the machine before him. His hands moved slowly at first, tracing the edges of the engine, checking wires, listening to faint sounds only he seemed to notice. He pressed his ear closer, tapped lightly in certain spots, and adjusted small parts as if he were reading a language written in bolts and steel. The employees watched closely. At first, they thought he was just pretending, moving things around to look confident. But soon, they noticed something strange. His movements weren't random. Each touch, each adjustment seemed intentional, practiced, and careful. "Wait," one whispered. "Look at his hands. He's not guessing. He knows exactly what he's doing." "Yeah," another replied, eyes wide. "It's like he's done this 1,000 times before." The CEO rolled his eyes and forced a laugh. "Please, don't be fooled by a bit of confidence. Anyone can jiggle a few wires. That doesn't mean he knows anything." But his laugh sounded weaker now, almost shaky. The janitor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rag he always carried. He wiped his hands, then bent lower, tightening a loose connection the CEO had overlooked. He adjusted the battery clamp, checked the spark plugs, and tapped gently at the carburetor. To him, it was simple, like sweeping the floor or changing a light bulb. The car was just another task, another challenge. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless, but not out of boredom, out of anticipation. Every time the janitor moved his hand, they leaned closer, waiting for something to happen. Their eyes shifted back and forth between the calm janitor and the increasingly tense CEO. Finally, the janitor straightened up. He stepped back slightly and said in his calm, steady voice, "Try now." The CEO blinked. "What?" "Turn the key," the janitor repeated. "The car should start." The crowd held its breath. The CEO, suddenly feeling exposed, hesitated. What if the car really did start? What would that mean? He forced a laugh to cover his hesitation. "Fine," he said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Let's prove this nonsense once and for all." He twisted the key. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, with a sudden roar, the engine came alive, smooth, strong, and flawless. The car that had refused to budge minutes ago now purred like a wild animal tamed. The sound filled the parking lot, drowning out every whisper, every laugh. The employees gasped, some covering their mouths, others exchanging looks of disbelief. A few even clapped their hands before quickly stopping. Worried about the CEO's reaction, the CEO froze in his seat, his hand still gripping the key. His face, drained of color, and his smirk vanished. He stared at the dashboard as if unable to believe what his own car was doing. The engine was perfect, flawless, fixed in less time than he had spent mocking the janitor. Slowly, stepped out of the car, his eyes locked on the janitor. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze, only shock. The man he had ridiculed, the man he had laughed at, had done the impossible with ease. The janitor didn't smile, didn't boast. He simply wiped his hands on the rag and picked up his broom again. To him, fixing the car was just another job, nothing more. But to the crowd, it was a revelation. Whispers filled the air. "I can't believe it. He fixed it in minutes. He knew exactly what to do. Who is this man really?" The CEO tried to speak, but no words came out. His arrogance had been silenced, crushed under the weight of the janitor's quiet skill. His promise, his own words, now hung over him like a heavy chain. "Fix this, and my car's yours." The janitor glanced at him briefly, his calm eyes meeting the CEO's frozen stare. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. Respect should never be based on wealth or title. True worth lies in ability, in dignity, in the things you cannot see at first glance. And in that moment, the once mighty CEO realized he was no longer the center of the story. The spotlight had shifted. The man he thought invisible had just outshone him in front of everyone. The roar of the engine echoed across the parking lot like thunder. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hum of the luxury car filled the silence, smooth and steady, as if mocking the very man who had declared it impossible to fix. The employees stood frozen, their mouths open, their eyes darting between the janitor and the CEO. The sound of the car was proof, undeniable proof that everything they had just witnessed was real. The janitor, calm as ever, simply stepped back, dusted his hands with the rag he carried, and picked up his broom again. To him, the task was done. To everyone else, the moment was extraordinary. All eyes turned to the CEO. He still sat stiffly in the driver's seat, his hand gripping the steering wheel like he was holding on for dear life. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. For a man who always had something sharp, clever, or cruel to say, this silence was shocking. His arrogance had always been his armor, his weapon. But now, that weapon had been ripped from him, and he had nothing left. The employees waited, almost holding their breath. What would he say? Would he laugh it off? Would he claim the janitor cheated somehow? Would he lash out in anger? They had seen him humiliate others countless times, always ready with a biting remark. But this time, nothing came. The CEO had been struck by something far heavier than ridicule. He had been struck by truth. A few of the employees glanced at one another, their eyes wide. Some of them were secretly smiling behind their hands. Others looked nervous, afraid the CEO might explode at any second. But the longer the silence stretched, the stranger it became. The janitor didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He leaned on his broom as though the scene meant nothing to him. His calmness made the CEO's silence even louder. At last, the CEO stepped out of the car. His shoes clicked against the pavement, but his usual confidence was gone. He looked around at the employees watching him, then at the janitor, who stood quietly with his broom. His mouth opened, but again, no sound came. He had no insult, no excuse, no way to escape the reality that his own arrogance had trapped him. One of the employees whispered, "He doesn't know what to say." Another whispered back, "He can't. He promised." We all heard it. The CEO's own words returned to him like echoes in his mind. "Fix this, and my car's yours." He had spoken them loudly, proudly, never thinking anyone could actually do it. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of his own trap. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to laugh, to say it was a joke. But how could he? Too many eyes were on him. Too many people had heard his promise. If he went back on his word, he wouldn't just look arrogant, he would look weak, a liar. A man who couldn't stand by his own boasts. For a man who built his entire identity on power and pride. That was worse than losing the car. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on everyone. The employees shuffled nervously, waiting for someone to break it. But the janitor stood calm, still, unbothered. That quiet dignity made the CEO's struggle even harder. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to force a smirk, but it wouldn't come. The muscles in his face betrayed him. His usual sneer, his mocking grin, gone. All that remained was a look of shock and confusion. The employees could see it now. The CEO, the man who had always seemed untouchable, was just a human being. a flawed, vulnerable man who had been outdone by the very person he mocked. One bold employee, unable to hold it in, whispered, "He froze." And the word spread like wildfire among the others. Froze. Yes. The CEO had frozen. The same man who commanded boardrooms, shouted orders, and ridiculed without fear was now speechless before a janitor with a broom. The janitor finally looked at him, but only for a second. His eyes were calm, steady, and almost kind. It wasn't a look of triumph or pride. It was a look that said, "I didn't do this to humiliate you. I just did what needed to be done." That made it worse. If the janitor had gloated, the CEO might have found a way to fight back. But how could he fight against silence, against humility? The crowd waited, but still, the CEO said nothing. The engine purred behind him, a reminder of his defeat. His silence was louder than any words could have been, and in that silence, a lesson settled heavily over everyone present. Power without respect is fragile, and arrogance crumbles when faced with true skill. The janitor picked up his broom fully, resting it on his shoulder. He was ready to return to his work, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To him, fixing the car was just a simple act. To everyone else, it was history being made in front of their eyes, and the CEO, one so full of laughter and mockery, stood there with nothing but silence. A silence that exposed the truth more clearly than any insult ever could. The cars. Engine continued to hum steadily, like a proud beast finally awakened. The employees were still whispering among themselves, eyes wide with disbelief. The CEO, silent and stiff, looked like a statue made of glass, ready to crack at any moment. And then, out of the stillness, came the voice everyone had almost forgotten. The janitor's voice. It was low, steady, and calm, the same as before. But this time, it carried something else too. Weight, experience, and a quiet pain that only life's hardships could carve into a person's soul. "I didn't want to embarrass you, sir," the janitor said softly. His words were not sharp, not mocking. They were simple, honest, and that made them even harder to ignore. The employees fell silent instantly, leaning in to listen. Even the CEO turned slightly, his pride forcing him to keep his eyes forward. But his ears betrayed him. He was listening. The janitor rested his broom lightly on the ground and looked at the car. "You see, before I worked here, before this uniform and broom, spent years as a mechanic. Not in fancy shops, not with luxury cars like this, but in small, dusty garages where customers begged me to save their broken machines. I've fixed engines in the freezing cold. I've worked with oil on my hands until midnight. I've pulled food on the table by tightening bolts." The employees exchanged glances. They had never heard him speak so much. Most of them barely knew his name. To them, he had always just been the quiet janitor who swept floors and emptied trash cans. But now, as he spoke, they realized there was more to him than they had ever imagined. "I used to own my own workshop," the janitor continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of memory. "It wasn't much, but it was mine. People trusted me with their cars, with their problems. I loved it. Fixing engines was more than work for MIT was a craft, something that gave me pride. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. A fire took everything. My shop, my savings, even the tools I had collected for years. After that, I had nothing left. Nothing but my hands, my knowledge, and the will to keep moving." The crowd was silent, their eyes locked on him. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, the story pricking at him like thorns. The janitor sighed, his eyes distant as if seeing the past. "I tried to start again, but bills piled up, debts grew, and doors closed in my face. People forgot what I could do. The only job I could find was here, cleaning floors, changing light bulbs. making sure your offices shine while you all go about your day. Nobody asked what I had done before. Nobody cared. To everyone, I was just the janitor. His voice didn't tremble with bitterness. Instead, it flowed with quiet truth. The employees felt it deep in their chests. Some of them lowered their eyes, ashamed that they had never once wondered about the man who cleaned their offices so faithfully. The CEO clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He wanted to dismiss the story, to say it didn't matter. But the calm, strength in the janitor's words held him still. This wasn't just a man defending himself. This was a man revealing the truth that had been buried under years of silence. And so, the janitor continued, "When you laughed at me, when you mocked me for holding a broom, I didn't get angry, 'cause I know what I am capable of. A job doesn't define a man. Clothes don't define a man. Respect, skill, dignity, that's what defines him. And respect is something you give, not something you demand." The employees' eyes shone. Some nodded quietly, as though they were hearing words they had needed all their lives. The truth was plain. The janitor had spoken more wisdom in 5 minutes than the CEO had given them in years. The janitor looked back at the CEO, his eyes steady but not cruel. "I fixed your car not to win it, not to shame you, but because you needed help. And because that's who I am. A man who fixes what's broken, whether it's a machine or maybe a moment like this." The silence after his words was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when truth filled the air. Leaving no room for arrogance or lies, the CEO's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. His chest rose and fell, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar sting in his pride. Yes, but also something deeper. Shame. A realization that he had mocked a man whose story he didn't know, whose skills he had dismissed, and whose dignity was greater than his own. The employees felt it too. Their gazes no longer carried pity for the janitor, but respect, deep and genuine. He wasn't just the man with the broom anymore. He was a craftsman, a survivor, a man who carried dignity in silence and proved it with action. And in that moment, the parking lot didn't feel like the CEO's stage anymore. It felt like the janitor's, because truth, humility, and hidden greatness had stolen the spotlight. The parking lot was no longer buzzing with whispers. It was silent, as if the entire world had paused to hear what would happen next. The car's engine still purred softly. It's a steady rhythm that mocked the silence of the man who once thought he ruled everyone with his words. The CEO stood frozen, his chest heavy, his mind running wild, but his lips refusing to move. The janitor, calm as ever, leaned lightly on his broom. He did not smirk, he did not boast. He did not even look at the car he had just repaired so effortlessly. His eyes stayed steady, humble, as if what he had done was no more important than sweeping the floor. That was what made the moment heavier. The janitor did not need applause, did not need praise. His calm presence alone had exposed the truth. The employees were the first to shift. Some straightened their backs as though courage had entered their veins. They looked at the janitor with a new kind of respect. Respect that was deep and long, genuine, not forced by fear or authority. For years, they had bowed their heads under the CEO's arrogance, but now they were seeing what true dignity looked like. And it wasn't in the man with the expensive suit. It was in the man with the broom. The CEO swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his pride burning like fire inside him. He wanted to speak, but every sentence his mind formed turned to ashes before it could reach his tongue. How could he speak now? He had mocked this man, belittled him, turned him into the butt of his jokes in front of everyone. And yet, in less than 10 minutes, the janitor had proven himself greater than all the CEO's arrogance combined. And then came the heaviest weight of all, his own words, "Fix this, and my car's yours." The employees remembered. T had. All heard it. Some of them glanced nervously at each other, waiting for the CEO to honor his word. Others secretly hoped he would, because that would mean something rare: justice. But could a man like him truly let go of his pride enough to keep his promise? The CEO finally opened his mouth. His voice cracked slightly. He paused, his eyes flickering between the janitor, the car, and the employees staring at him. I didn't think. I didn't expect. His words stumbled out like broken glass. For the first time, his sentences carried no power, no arrogance. They sounded human, vulnerable. The janitor said nothing. He did not demand the car. He did not remind the CEO of his promise. Simply waited. His calmness, more powerful than any demand could ever be. The CEO looked at him again, and something inside him cracked. A lifetime of arrogance, of mocking those he thought beneath him, weighed heavily on his shoulders. For years, he had believed respect could be bought with wealth, demanded with power, or forced through fear. But now, here stood a man who had no wealth, no title, no authority, and yet, in this moment, commanded more respect than he ever had. The CEO's chest rose and fell as he let out a shaky breath. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys. The employees gasped softly, their eyes widening. He looked at the keys, then at the janitor. For a long moment, he seemed torn between his pride and his word. Finally, with a heavy heart, he extended the keys forward. "You fixed it," he said quietly. His voice was low, almost defeated. "And I gave my word." The employees stared, stunned. Some could hardly believe what they were seeing. The CEO, the man who never bowed, now holding out his prized car keys to the janitor. But the janitor did something none of them expected. He shook his head slowly and took a step back. "I don't want your car," he said simply. His voice was calm, steady, but firm. "I fixed it because it needed to be fixed, not because I wanted a reward." The CEO froze, the keys still in his hand. The crowd's eyes darted between the two men. The janitor continued, "Respect is not bought with money. Respect is not earned by giving away expensive things. Respect comes when you treat others with dignity, no matter who they are or what job they do. Keep your car, sir, but maybe fix the way you look at people." The words landed heavier than the roar of the engine. They struck not only the CEO, but every employee standing there. It was a lesson so simple, yet so powerful, that it carved itself into their hearts. The CEO lowered his hands slowly, the keys shaking slightly between his fingers. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt before. The car he had once used, as a symbol of pride, now felt meaningless compared to the dignity of the man standing before him. The employees, on the other hand, looked at the janitor with awe. To them, he was no longer invisible, no longer just the man with the broom. He was proof that greatness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it holds a broom. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for a moment like this to shine. And so, the parking lot that morning became more than just a place where a car had broken down. It became a place where arrogance was humbled, where hidden greatness was revealed, and where an entire group of people learned a lesson they would never forget. The CEO never mocked the janitor again. And for many of the employees, that day became a quiet reminder: never underestimate anyone, for respect and skill can come from the most unexpected places. And the janitor, he picked up his broom, smiled faintly, and returned to his work, as if fixing engines and teaching lessons in dignity. We're all just part of an ordinary day,